To begin, if you want to open your Bibles up to 1 Peter in chapter 3, third chapter, beginning in verse 8. We have a slightly longer reading for today's class. Sometimes this part of 1 Peter gets broken up into two sections, and there's often good reasons for that, but we're going to approach them as a combined set because the message seems to interact back and forth between verses, say, 8 through 16, 17 or so, and then through the rest of the chapter. And so I think as we read through it, though, we'll kind of see how those connections work. In a moment, we will kind of get into that, have some introductory comments, but right now, if you would, we're going to approach our King and Creator in prayer. Heavenly Father, we deeply appreciate the good that you do in our lives and the relationships that we share in Christ. Help us understand our purpose and plan on the earth, individually and as a community of disciples of your Son. Help us as we grow our faith and understanding of not only the kingdom, but our own selves and our faith, that you grant us wisdom and insight. Please forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, again, this is 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 all the way through the end of the third chapter. And we're going to break it down right now for our reading into three distinct sections, just so we can get through the reading at the top of the class. Les, would you read, if you would, verses 8 through 13? And then Rick, from the back, if you could read verses 13 through 17. If you could, you got that in the back, Rick? And then 13 through 17. And then after that, Carson, could you finish up and read verses 18 through 22 for us?
Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil, or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. For whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil, and his lip from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good?
Rick, you want to pick up there in verse 14, Rick? You got that? 1 Peter chapter 3, or is your device looking too small for your eyes like mine often does? Rich, do you want to grab that then? Verse 14? Yeah, well, yeah. Verse 14 through verse 17, Rick.
Even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And do not be afraid of their threats, nor of the trouble, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. Having a good conscience, that when they defame you as evildoers, those who are following your good conduct in Christ may be ashamed. For it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil.
Carson.
Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience. Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him.
So there's a lot of information kind of swirling through verses 8 through the end of the chapter, right? And also, how many of those independent verses sounded like some of your memory verses are things that you just have pounded into your brain so you don't forget. Like 3 or 4 of those phrases or verses are ones that are in my memory bank of things I try to make sure I retain a precise memory of, including the statement about the connection between baptism and Noah and its salvation aspect, and the context around defending our convictions, and trying to understand our primary idea is, why is it that people who are not only abjectly morally good, but seeking to be in the favor of God, are found to be suffering? And often, and this is maybe my failing, maybe it's yours too, we tend to dissect those sections apart. And we say, baptism, over here. Well, defending my faith, that's over here. I'm giving like a defense for the hope that's in me. And then suffering, that's over here. We make them 3 separate principles. And I hope that today, at least, we can see that, yes, they are separate concepts that the Bible teaches in a number of different ways. But if you notice in this context, they're all heavily related. When suffering strikes anybody, like when it's all of a sudden things go bad, but that person doesn't they themselves crumble under the weight of the suffering, how does the world or you and I respond and look at someone who does that? What do we think about them? Well, the ones who crumble, there's weak. The ones who are strong, they've just got such a resolute will. Their mind must be so focused, right? Or what else? What are some of the other solutions that we impute, we give them? We haven't talked to them yet. We just see they seem to be holding up pretty well. And what do we think is going on? How are they holding it all together? What's going on there? I look at them and I go, what's their secret? What do they know that I don't know? And if you ever start paying attention to storytellers in like movies, television, books, or even in person, a storyteller hides that secret and reveals it later. The secret to their attitude, their success. And if you want like a bingo card for Hallmark movies, there's always going to be one of those in there too. Some secret aspect of a person and how they hold it all together, and then they teach it to the younger person so the person younger than them can also hold it all together. It's a very classic way of helping people understand things, is to reveal that surprise. Well, in context, we tend to think about that little phrase about give a reason for the hope or a defense for the hope within you broadly. To say this is about my faith and my convictions. But if we narrow it into its context and ask this question: when the whole world is falling apart and you're not, and everything around you is awful, and you have a hope that is heavenward focused, in context, that's the first layer of this. It says, hey, why aren't you rejecting your faith? Why aren't you running out of this pressure cooker into an easier life somewhere else? Why aren't you giving up? And the context answer for these Christians who are suffering is, we have to explain why. So inasmuch as this passage sometimes can and should be used in a more apologetic sense about the wideness of your faith, its immediate context is actually, when suffering, you need to be able to explain to someone while the suffering is in essence worth it. Even if you, A, don't understand the extent of the suffering, and B, don't have a clear resolution as to when the suffering will diminish, and when times of refreshing will follow. Because in context, we are given a single future pinpoint as the greatest thing to latch on to in regards to relieving your suffering. Jesus' death and resurrection is the foundation for the release of the pressure of the suffering Christian. That he died and rose, we will die and rise. And it's not just about our baptism in that picture, which is part of it, but it's actually about a end of things view. That this earth isn't all that there is. And so there's these three things that come up. Les?
I think when someone wonders how you get through things that are extremely difficult, when you tell them it's because you're not doing it alone, there's things that you have to turn over to God. He will help you. He will let you.
Yeah.
Sometimes we try to bear our own burdens too much and are too slow to get the help that is there for us. And a lot of that strengthens your faith and you become stronger every time.
And I find this little side point that I find interesting that helps us kind of see what's going on here. Who is it that calls Peter or Paul's writings, I gave my answer away, hard to understand? I said Peter, right? Peter does that. And I recently had read a lot of suggestions that when Paul's writings are being discussed, that's an idiom that potentially means they're complicated, they're complex, they're like a mosaic, and they're beautiful as well. But if you pay attention to what Peter is doing here, he does a lot of the same kind of things that Paul does, where he takes a number of ideas that all have some thematic connections together and beautifully weaves them together to show that it's not just one thing going on, because he's talking about our election, that's connection into the kingdom of Christ, our ethics, our community, and our mission as disciples. And he wove that together with our relationships with governing authorities, those we work with and under, even our marital relationships, and how all of those various principles latch together to adjust our perception of what actually is going on. That there is a conflict that's fleshly, but that spiritual conflict is the one that matters, and that begins to really impact exactly what it is that we need to be thinking about when the world seems awful, and how, if you get back to verse 8 again, we can be of one mind. We can be unified in a spiritual sense, have that kind of sympathetic care for one another and brotherly love that we're looking for. There is a lot that Peter is packing in there. But quite frankly, we don't always pay attention because our needs are somewhere else. Our needs are about helping someone understand the value of baptism, or our needs are about a separate, high priority, immediate issue. So, let's kind of think about this in tying these themes together and ask this question. How would you describe or define what it means for you to fear the Lord? What's that, Bobby? Respect. So respect is a key possibility there. What else?
Usually it's a submission to authority, so you're recognizing the authority.
So layer number one, which is really on par, is respect. Rich has added submission to the authority inherent in that. What else might we include in this idea of fear the Lord? Well, we've got this passage here in 1 Peter 3, 8 through 22. It certainly talks about it in the bigger picture. Isaiah 8 talks about it. Psalm 34 talks about it in different ways. Let's go over to Isaiah, the 8th chapter first. I want to read just one of these two compatriot texts. Just 1 second here. All right. Just like Rick, I think my eyes are not doing what I want them to do with the machine, or the machine's not obeying my commands, but we're finally there. All right. And I say it's an eyesight thing, that's a me thing, Rick. I can't see anything anymore, and it's about this far away or this far. It has to be really far away, or I have to have my glasses on. So beginning in verse 11 of Isaiah 8, you have a kind of a big picture view of some of these things going on, and there's a way in which the prophet Isaiah lays this out that goes all the way through, say, for right now, verse 15. Verse 11 reads as follows: "For the Lord spoke thus to me with his strong hand upon me, and warned me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, do not call conspiracy all the time this people calls conspiracy, and do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. And he will become a sanctuary, and a stone of offense, and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel, and a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and many shall stumble on it. They shall fall and be broken. They shall be snared and taken." So I kind of love the interplay here that Isaiah has to explain this concept of fear the Lord in regards to submission and respect. But he includes an attitude or these adjectives of fear and dread depending on your behavior, your choices. So both the segments of Israel and Jerusalem as a city are under condemnation at this point. And they said they should fear the Lord, but do so with dread. And you who are seeking to follow the Lord, same emotions, but you should find sanctuary in that same moment. That's a complicated thing to work out in your head, that the same actions and the same settings can produce wildly different responses. Because of the might of the one whose hand is on the shoulder of the prophet, his strong arm. You ever have someone pull you in like that is so physically imposing that you feel like, hey, maybe they might squeeze me too much? My buddy Seth has lost some muscle mass since he was really, really strong. But his peak playing weight was like 320 pounds. An offensive lineman for the Dolphins and the Bills, a big guy. And you guys all think I'm pretty big, right? Next to Seth, I am absolutely not. Even now, he's quite certainly stronger and bigger than me. And we pulled me in for a hug the last time I saw him when he was still playing. I said, bro, that's enough. Like, I can't take more than that. And he's like, I forgot, because he's not used to hugging other big guys, because most everyone's so much smaller than him. So much power held in there, and he was obviously still holding it back. You think about that in this picture of God having that same kind of capacity, but there's no earthly measure by it. We can't really compare it to anything. Because the power of God exceeds even the great schemes of man when we try to reform the universe into our own will, because it is supernatural as well. His power reaches into the spiritual realm, which some of the prophets are granted liberty to see into. And some of the New Testament writers have some level of insight too. But even they can't fully articulate it in a way for us that relates that experience to us, because we haven't experienced it. Paul's approach to it is, I know a guy. And clearly he's talking about himself. And then John's approach to it is, I'm going to tell you that it was like this. Which helps you understand that it's not that. It's just like this. And then he says it's in signs and symbols there in Revelation 1. So with that picture of fearing the Lord, and you go back to this perception of successful endurance in times of suffering, we've already identified that I think the resurrection is a key factor here. But fearing the Lord in the process of this is part of that mechanism, if you will. It's one thing to say I have a heavenward focus and it's all about heaven, but that's not the entire equation of the Bible. God's power is presented as part of this as well. And whether we confine it to the narrowness of the idea of hell, or we include everything else that God talks about, because this judgment here for Israel was first physical and then spiritual. So they were going through a kind of crucible that put them through two consequences of their outcome. And the Christians here was first physical and then spiritual too. But it's hard to say that their physical experiences were that much different than that of Israel's.
I'm trying to recall some of the words in the Old Testament for the word Lord, and there were several connotations to it, and I can't help but think that this is a lean towards the father-child relationship. So there is a guiding hand on him in addition to being a sanctuary. So it's very similar to a parent-child relationship, right? As far as guiding, but also know that I'm able to protect you and able to be with you and help you get through things. And so that's kind of where my mind is going as far as the relationship here when we're dealing with various, I guess in the context of Peter here, the various suffering that they're going to end up dealing with. But also know that God is there to be a sanctuary,
Yeah.
and to help them through it. And probably the biggest thing for, I would say, all of us is when we need help, to be able to accept help when people are offering it, right? And so that's probably the biggest thing is say, hey, I need some help, but not. We'll see what happens later, but maybe later. But and if somebody offers you help, you're like, nah, I got it.
Yeah. So, in regards to your thing about Lord, the most common word that's used Lord is the Hebrew word we say Adonai. It is translated Lord sometimes. And then we have the Hebrew word that's missing all its vowels, which we pronounce alternatively Hashem or Yahweh. But that also gets translated Lord sometimes based on its context, especially when you have repeats like Lord, Lord. Sometimes they use those two words next to each other, or it's because we don't know. We don't know what to do with Yahweh. It's kind of an odd word. And then we have the larger word that's also connected to it, Elohim, which is all of God in the concrete sense of whom God is as the Father. So that relationship there, those are the words that are being used, kind of narrows down to this. We think about a Lord, all those iterations, and a vassal or son, a servant. What do we do then? Well, when we're in trouble, if you're subordinate to a more powerful entity, you go hide in their keep when it's bad. That's kind of the basic imagery of this. And so Peter, Isaiah, which I think Peter is kind of layered on top of here, he's using that same prophetic style of Isaiah, is telling us that you've got to get your mind under the idea that I'm resting under the security of a God who has the power to reshape the universe. And be comfortable in that spot. All of us have comfort levels to where we can be next to something that has greater and greater levels of power capacity. Like eventually there's a point for each of us, I think, where it's like, I can't be any closer to that. because there's so much stored up energy in it that it might not go how I want it to go. I can't direct it the right way, and I get a little more anxious. We all have a level. Well, God is saying get close to the most powerful thing of things and trust me. Trust me in the middle of it. That connects to the larger principles we've talked about inside the text, like why does this happen to good people, which we'll talk about in a second. What do we do in the middle of it, like practically? And then also, what's going on with the connection to baptism at the end of this? Like I said before, and we're going to start there. Very often when we talk about the idea of the impact or the effectiveness of baptism, this is one of the passages we turn to explain it to ourselves. So on a practical level, what is Peter telling us that baptism does? It saves us, right? And what is the appeal? Is it this baptistry water, which is the warmest, most comfortable baptistry water I've ever been in? If you're there too long, you're going to take a nap. Like, it's nice. Appreciate it. Is it washing my flesh? So what's getting washed?
Conscience.
Or-
For a good conscience.
Yeah. Or for those who are like me and have a good rooting in the Appalachian, what's getting washed? Throw that extra R in there. Or rinsed. You're going to rinse it off. So that's what's going on. It's my conscience is being made clear in the appeal to God. That's baptism is discussed that same way in the text of Romans. So you have that idea there. But what does my baptism have to do with suffering?
That's where we get a connection to the one that can help us through the suffering.
Yeah. It ties us into a story that we have trust in. Like, I trust in the resurrection story because it's history. I trust it. And theologically, other parts of the Bible tell me that baptism links me to the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus. So now my suffering is in light of that relationship I have to Christ, and in context, my suffering is now made similar, not the same, similar to the suffering of Christ. Even though I may never be on the cross, even though my suffering, I can intellectually acknowledge, will almost always be lighter than the Christ or someone else I make up. Oh, they got it worse than me. Or, and we'll circle this back to the beginning of the class, that person I know who has it better, or seems to has it all together when things are really bad, and I'm telling myself, I don't know if I can make it through that. Their suffering seems so worse, and maybe it is. Maybe it's really worse. But we are united in those experiences because of part of the why they're taking place. And I also acknowledge, and that means that not all suffering is due to my faith. Some of my suffering is due to me being dumb. Or as some, like the New American Standard says in its translation, to being stupid. There's a layer of my sorrow and my suffering because I am often my own worst enemy. So that's part of it. So I know that God has a connection to suffering that takes place because of my faith. Some of my suffering, and that amount varies based on life, is due to me. But then there's other suffering, right? I can identify that not all suffering is my fault or because of my faith. Some of it is because random life happens. Someone else makes a choice in front of me that I am now downhill from. And so it just rolls right over me. Physically, literally, and all those things. And I have to live with that afterwards. That suffering, too, all fits into this big box of how do we endure and why do I suffer, in this case, Now, even if we're not even doing anything, I just happened to be there. In the most simplified sense, then, I will suggest to you that this is a way to read this part of the text and get better at defending your faith. Because it's not so much just about your faith, it's the hope that's within you. And why do you still hope? Because of the resurrection. Why haven't you given up your faith? Because I believe in Jesus. But that belief hasn't gotten you anything now. You're a captive of the Roman Empire, or your house just burnt down, or you just lost everything, or everything you thought mattered is gone. You're Job, and you feel alone. All those things are things that people you probably don't recognize have gone through that are modern day Christians. People that you may have met and seen on either end of that experience. So within the confines of this text, that's really being the kind of the key drawing point, is that it's trying to pull us to this idea, this principle, that our greatest defense for our hope is our Christ and our relationship with Him. And yes, it is commenced in that crucible of the baptism experience. And everything goes with it. Because it's not just that singular moment that we value, right? Because how do we express the method or the sequence that God has laid out for someone to become part of the kingdom? We got all kinds of methods, right? What's the 5-step version? That's the one we all kind of remember.
Hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. Right.
And by the way, the hand was the first iteration of it that I'm aware of in U.S. history. Much like Deuteronomy has a similar one. That's not the only way we express it, though. Sometimes we just quote Bible passage. It says, here's some Christians doing things, and they did this, and they taught that. You should do that too. We don't always iterate it in our shorthand. Now you won't remember the shorthand method will stick with you. Methodology, because we are in a longer conversation with someone. And for some people, baptism might be the easy question to answer, but it may be hard to go to God for forgiveness and ask. Because remember, that's part of the concept. It's an appeal to God for a clear conscience, not the washing of the flesh, but it's the clearing of yourself. So now put that back into our big context of enduring suffering. Les?
In coming back to the main question of why do good people suffer, Paul answers that pretty good in 2 Corinthians 12 when he says that he prayed 3 times for his infirmity to be removed. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that he shouldn't leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong.
Yeah. He's not the only one who has to go through that journey. Think about, we'll say, Abram. Because it's important to remember that he kind of had a little bit of a rough spat there as Abram. He's a lawkeeper. He was trying to keep God's law, but he was also a forgiven lawbreaker. There are times when both he and Sarah conspired to reject the plan of God and institute their own, and God forgave them. Even though we view him as, well, he's the chief patriarch in the lineage side of the story, he's a beginning point in some ways, and he is identified for us as an emblematic view of faith, that you can have this kind of superiorized faith. He is most clearly identified as a righteous sufferer. That really is the most unified way that he is shown in the largest part of his story. Someone who was trying to be righteous and yet still suffered. Which is Paul. Trying on his end as much as within him to do what was right and yet still suffered. And you can see that story again and again with the prophets, with some of the kings, with God's people as a people, Christians as a community. All of those are revealed that, hey, this is how it is. Now that asks us one question that we don't necessarily incorporate in this, which is a great thing to think about because it's hard to reconcile. But it's very similar, and we'll kind of introduce it. And this is your lunch tabletop discussion for you guys at lunch today. We'll start it. The problem of evil. Why is there evil in the world? And we're going to talk about it in our Wednesday night class too, a little bit later. But think about that for a second. God, who is good inherently, made a creation that was pure and able to be with him. But in their rebellion, changed the relationship in such a way that the kind of evil that causes this kind of suffering still remained and remains in the world around us. And what do we do with that kind of evil? Is it a man? Is it mankind? That's a complex thing, right? Well, there's no simple answer to it. Well, it's the devil. Because that's only part of the equation. The devil is shown consistently only to tempt or draw. And there is a whole spiritual warfare conflict that we don't really, at least in my perception, have much grasp of. We know it's there. We got some hints. It gets revealed to us from time to time, but there's a lot more going on than just terra firma and the biology of life. So that brings us to kind of placing it into the larger message. This is a one way to outline 1 Peter, and so you can kind of see right now this larger section that began in the middle of our reading kind of goes through chapter 4 and verse 19 to how we respond to various types of persecution. And you'll note that in the 4th chapter, grace becomes part of the conversation. And so we're fitting this into this larger picture of Peter's letter. There's more going on to how we see all of this than just these little pieces. Pulling them together as a big book is super important because Peter wrote this not as a book of Proverbs, but as a letter. Which is something I think it's easy for us to turn the letters into as Proverbs. Here's a verse. It's like Proverbs 23:23, and so we treat it that way. Any extra thoughts or questions on this reading of this part of the text? Things that are important to you that we didn't cover? Or unfinished things that I said we'd talk about and maybe I forgot? Because that's always possible. Les?
One thing that I keep going back to in the suffering and, people want to know how you get through things, you tell them God. What I wonder many times is how people get through extremely difficult things in life when they don't lean on God. And the answer is, a lot of times they don't get through it well. They break up, a lot of times it will break up their families, it will break up marriages, be devastating things because they don't have that to lean on, and they're trying to work through their own earthly desires and passions and remedies.
Here's something to think about and a way to understand your fellow man a little bit better in this same position, because I think this is something all of us can capture on well with. In the creation of that dissonance in your mind where things aren't well, there's all kinds of medical terms for it, psychological terms for it. and we've got our own personal vocabulary of it. One of the biggest factors that causes a rise in anxiety is an inability to sleep well. And when you see somebody who is tired, there's all kinds of responses to it. Oh, did you work really hard yesterday? Could be. Could be they didn't sleep well. Could be because their body isn't great. It's fighting every disease and problem. But it also could be not sleeping well because of physical stress, spiritual stress, emotional stress. And so almost always, you find that person in that box where they're not sleeping well, that's the moment you go serve. Say, hey, let's talk. Let's find out what's going on. The person in the world who has no spiritual rest, it's difficult for them to have that kind of good sleep. Even if they're not cognitively aware of it. Even if they live in a world, well, God doesn't exist, so why should I be troubled by it? They still have all those same troubled stresses that we do, but there's no outlet for it. And eventually you kind of recognize that when there's no outlet for something, what happens to the pressure inside of it? It'll eventually burst out. So if you decide you're the kind of person who just kind of keeps their emotions in forever, guess what's going to happen? When you least expect it, the pipe's going to burst, and it's not going to be what you want it to be. So putting it in this area about what Les is talking about, to the unbeliever, the agnostic, you're just waiting for that pipe to burst. Now, for those of us who do believe, it helps us understand that part of our stresses we can find a resolution to in God. Doesn't mean we have all the answers. There are physiological things we can't fix right away, emotional things that take a lot of time to work through. That's why I love that there are trained individuals to help us sort through a lot of those things. And we get to rely on our brethren. There's a certain comfort in knowing that you're not alone. I think that's part of the communal picture that Peter is angling towards in this text, is to help us understand whether we are the dispersed Israelites of the first century or the dispersed child of God in the 21st century. You're not alone. And think about it this way. This will get to the last tidbit. We can go through our questions in a second if you want to. How many Christians do you know that right now worship in a community of disciples smaller than the church at Eastside? Do you know any? No, 1, 2, 3? Do you guys feel like Eastside is a small church? Remember this. Eastside actually is right in the middle band of the average size of a church in the United States. Of any kind. Now, if we go amongst churches of Christ, we are actually statistically slightly larger than that middle point. But we're a small church, right? It's all a myth. All of those things are things we arbitrarily decided in our heads. Size, relationship, closeness, these are all things we actually have. Once we got that size label, we actually have control over our closeness. Who determines the size of the church at Eastside? Do the elders decide that? Members? Is it about how effective we're at spreading the gospel? Does that actually determine the size of the church at Eastside? Who adds people to the church? God does. If we believe that generically, you also have to trust that locally it's the same thing. That he added someone to the church here because we needed them or they needed us. Or they got added here and they moved somewhere else because they life or whatever. It was all part of that trust plan. And realize that a lot of your brethren, in fact, most of your brethren, don't have the support network that you do at Eastside. That's something that I always kind of have to freak out about because you do the math as you're thinking about it. If every church is smaller, and most of them are, that means most of your brethren do not have the kind of support that we offer to each other. So we should be super thankful for it, but also super mindful about those who would be in those circumstances. Like they're far more alone than we are. All right, final questions there for our negative 1 minute. I think it's time for the bell. Whenever Les decides to hit it is the official time. All right, Les said it's time, so I gave him that authority. All right, we'll continue in our study next Sunday as we pick up in chapter 4 and verse 1. Thanks, everyone.